Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Another thing I think is worth underlining here and continuing to talk about is the fact that at least some of these hostages, several of them, is my understanding, are Americans. They're U.S. citizens, some of them born in the United States. And Hamas in recent days has been releasing videos of some of them as proof of life, purportedly. So this is a April 24th story in the L.A. Times. Nearly 7 months into the Israel-Hamas war, Hamas released a video Wednesday of California-born hostage Hirsch Goldberg Pollen. It is the first time the American-Israeli citizen who was severely injured when Hamas attacked the Nova Music Festival on October 7th, has been shown alive since his capture. He's 23 years old. Kim, in the video, he's missing part of his left hand and his arm. And there was some testimony previously from survivors that he had been injured in the attack. And Kim, again, this is something that I think is easy for Americans to forget, but there are American citizens that are currently being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza.
Yeah, by some estimates, 5 Americans. And I would just point out all of this underlines the despicability, the cruelty of Hamas and the people that we are talking about here. I mean, these hostages have now been held for more than 200 days. I would note that as this ceasefire was being discussed, that when Hamas offered those 33 hostages, now we know dead or alive, they said that they would only be talking initially about returning women, older men, and the sick and the wounded, meaning that they have kept those women and older men and the sick and the wounded for all this period of time, and goodness knows in what types of condition. I also think it's noteworthy that some of these hostage videos that Hamas has been releasing, and there has been more than one, those who watched them described those that were talking, the hostages, as being under duress, meaning that they were clearly being forced to speak and to call for an end to the war. So they're now being used as a certain degree as propaganda pieces as well from Hamas too, as they try to inflict more pressure for Israel to stand down in their operation. I think it just underlines the rightness of Israel's determination to see an end to Hamas and finish this operation, because these are not the kind of people. If these are the sort of people that are handling hostages this way, you are not going to be able to trust anything that they put forward going forward.
Let's turn to President Biden's speech on Tuesday morning. He warned of a, quote, ferocious, unquote, surge of anti-Semitism in an address at the U.S. Capitol in honor of Holocaust Remembrance Day. Let's listen to a piece of what Biden said.
This hatred continues to lie deep in the hearts of too many people in the world, and requires our continued vigilance and outspokenness. That hatred was brought to life on October 7th in 2023. On the sacred Jewish holiday, the terrorist group Hamas unleashed the deadliest day of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Driven by ancient desire to wipe out the Jewish people off the face of the earth.
Ellie, what did you make of President Biden's remarks? I guess I give him some credit for some moral clarity. That is the Joe Biden that we saw shortly after October 7th, but where has he been in recent weeks?
I think he said some important things, acknowledging that there has been a surge, a ferocious surge, saying that American Jews are not alone right now. He said things that people needed to hear. He also said never again means never forget, and that he will not forget October 7th. He said that his support for Israel is ironclad. The problem with saying these things is that at the very same time, we are being treated to news report after news report about how President Biden is now delaying support for Israel, delaying military aid, weapons shipments, weapons sales. And these are JDAMs, which are needed to create guided munitions, so crucial for any Israeli military operation, and also with just basic artillery, munitions, tank rounds, And so you kind of have to ask the question, when he talks about this ironclad support, when he talks about lessons of the Holocaust, I mean, what lessons is he drawing? Sometimes in the West, I think the lesson that people draw is you should offer sympathy to the Jewish people and you should feel bad about what happened to them. And in some ways, what continues. In Israel, I think they take some different lessons. They take a lesson that one must fight and that there's no substitute for doing that. And I think after October 7th, the lesson they've taken is that they have to win. They can't continue living with genocidal terrorists on their border. They can't just teach those terrorists a lesson. They have to actually defeat them. And so President Biden said important things, but I'm waiting to see if that lesson hits home.
Kim, what's your read of this speech? And we'll play another clip here, add some more fodder to the conversation. President Biden also addressed the campus protests and encampments that have roiled college campuses in recent weeks. Listen to this.
In America, we respect and protect the fundamental right to free speech, to debate and disagree, to protest peacefully, and make our voices heard. I understand that's America, but there is no place on any campus in America, any place in America, for anti-Semitism or hate speech or threats of violence of any kind, whether against Jews or anyone else. Violent attacks, destroying property, is not peaceful protest. It's against the law. And we are not a lawless country. We're a civil society. We uphold the rule of law. And no one should have to hide or be brave just to be themselves.
Kim, do you think that met the moment?
I think it's moving closer, and I think it's well overdue given all those days, weeks that President Biden was silent on this issue. And I'm glad to hear all the words that he spoke, but I would nonetheless note that there still is an element of kind of threading the needle here. Because one thing, if you listen to that speech, is it's one thing to go out and say, I feel your pain and I have solidarity with Jews and I support the security of Israel and an independent Jewish state. He said all of those things. That's good. And to also say there's no place for this or that. But that's different than actually calling out those who are doing it, criticizing them specifically, and addressing the root causes of this, which, by the way, are in part a protest of his own policies. I would just note there was a very interesting contrast there between President Biden, who spoke after House Speaker Mike Johnson at the same event. And he was much more blunt about calling out what he said was an anti-Semitic virus that was spreading across campuses because universities were allowing these areas to become hostile spaces for Jewish professors and Jewish students. And so he was much more direct in talking about universities and the general culture on university campuses that have given rise to this kind of mayhem we see going on out there. And I know it's a subtle point, but there is a difference there between that kind of pointing the finger at what exactly is the problem and Joe Biden just condemning that it's happening, which is not exactly the same thing.
Hang tight. We'll be right back after one more break. Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I have to agree with Kim here. That strikes me as the bare minimum that the President of the United States ought to say. No threats of violence, no vandalism, don't break the law. But I was hoping for a more pointed criticism of these forces on campus, Elliot. And notable that these protests continue. The headline at WBUR right now is that protesters reclaim encampment at MIT as university threatens suspension. On Monday, Columbia University announced that it would replace, that's the word in the news story, the university-wide commencement ceremony on May 15th and have smaller school-based celebrations, according to the school announcement. And Elliot, President Biden could have gone after these protesters as denying to their fellow students the education that they are paying for, the education that by right as students they ought to have, these kind of ceremonies like commencement, public spaces on campus, and so on and so forth.
You're right. And I think it's worth recognizing that the spread of these encampments, this is not a spontaneous thing, the youth of America, expressing their feelings. I mean, there are very specific groups with agendas that have been well known. I mean, Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, the national group praised October 7th right after it happened. And they organized days of resistance in solidarity with the attack before Israel had even begun its response. This is where they are. And if you look at the adult leadership of these groups, you have overlap with members of previous organizations that were fundraising for Hamas and were shut down by U.S. law enforcement. I mean, this is a group with a chapter on every campus that has real plans for encampments, for keeping out other students, for how to deal with the media. And you're seeing sophisticated operations, student activists working with outside activists. It's not just infiltrators coming in and making it something it's not. No, they're, working toward the same purpose. And there's real planning and real money. And one problem that President Biden has is that this is part of the activist base of the Democratic Party. This is his coalition. And so does he want to condemn elements of the coalition? Does he want to go after them and actually make a difference on the campuses? If he wants to, there are options available to him. But so far, we haven't seen that.
Kim, we'll give you the last word, but let's end with a story from George Washington University. We've talked about how different campuses are handling these protests in different ways, but something fascinating is happening there in Washington, D.C. The president of GW has decried a, quote, illegal and potentially dangerous occupation of GW property. But amazingly, the Metropolitan Police in the District of Columbia are saying that they will not help clear that encampment. Here's the statement last week from the police chief, Pamela Smith. I think here in the District of Columbia, we allow people the opportunity to have freedom of speech. And that's what we're seeing right now. There has been no violence, no violent behavior, no confrontations, unquote. And so, Kim, I find that remarkable. If you have somebody camped on your front lawn, I guess, don't call the police in the District of Columbia if they're not being violent, because apparently there's no property anymore in the District of Columbia.
Apparently not. Especially, this is remarkable given that the GW president actually enumerated as well the problems that were going on in campus, the rules that were being broken, and the violations of the law, just in terms of this being private property and people being engaged in activities that the owner of that property have said are not allowed. She noted that the encampments were not lawful. She noted that these protesters had vandalized a university statue and a flag. There were anti-Semitic images and hateful rhetoric, that they were chasing people off the public square who they didn't feel had a right to be there. I mean, this is the lunatics running the asylum and the president of a university asking law enforcement to allow them to maintain or retake control and being denied. And you have to know that some of this has to do with the D.C. political environment, and Muriel Bowser of D.C. probably in solidarity with a lot of very progressive lawmakers that are not unhappy to see some of these protests going on. It could just be a demoralization among the police force. I would note that D.C. has been losing cops right and left. Last year, it had the fewest number of cops any time on its force in the past 50 years. And they certainly have a lot of other issues they're dealing with, from carjackings to murders. But I think the remarkable thing was that what was cited here was not a lack of manpower, but a lack of will and a pronouncement by the police that they would decide what was lawbreaking or not, despite all the clear evidence in front of them. We now have some of the Republicans in Congress threatening to use legislative action because they do have some sort of joint authority within the district. We will see where that goes, but this was really pretty shameful.
Thank you, Kim and Elliot. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.